Tasha's the host. Tasha's the.
There.
That's what happened last week. That's why I couldn't.
Okay, you're recording. You're recording.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. So good to see you. This is going to be a very interesting year because the Father has just been working on different areas since, going through school and all this. There's a lot of new reframing in my mind. But also this year, it was kind of like he was saying, it's time to start Abbas Yeshiva or Abbas University. And I don't know if you know this, but the universities were actually created by Christians who wanted a place for people to learn. Well, in the Jewish realm, yeshivas have been there for a long, long time, way before universities. And they were a place for them to learn. So this is what we're going to do. I did mention, and this is where the reframing of it comes in. I did mention in December that we were starting to go into trauma, because that is, I'm a trauma interventionist, and that is what I've been working on for the past few years. And so it would still be the same, but he just said, we're going to start from the beginning. We're going to start from who are we and what happens and how does trauma develops? Because unfortunately, we think that only those that have a very long testimony of drug addiction or being in jail for this, that, or the other, or having a horrible life because this and that and the other happened to them. We think that those are the only ones that have trauma. And I just heard this doctor, and I was trying to find her name this morning and I couldn't find it, but I will eventually find it. And because she created a whole system of developing using movement to develop different parts of our body that got, when we have trauma, it somatizes, it lands somewhere in our body because our body doesn't know what to do with it. So that's just, it can just go away. It has to be worked through. That's why we are called overcomers. And so then as I'm listening to all these teachings, I realized, Abba kept telling me, that's why you're an overcomer. That's why the bride is getting herself ready. That's why, all the scriptures will just start popping in my mind. And he didn't say only those that had trauma will have to overcome. We all have to. So that means that we all have a common denominator for all of us. There is a trauma that we all have experienced. So digging into that with him, thinking, okay, all the teachings I get in science and are not, even though they may acknowledge God and mention him in any of the places that, like Dr. Amen is a believer, so he'll mention God in the midst of all that. Here and there, they're still coming from a physiological, a natural, a science-based understanding of trauma. So what Abba's been doing with me is mixing those and bringing them in a way that we can understand from a spiritual perspective. How does that apply to us? Because we all have this vessel, we all have a tent, a temporary tent that we live in. That means that we all have a physiology and a science-based part of us that came from the ground. He made us from the dust, from a material, from something tangible, but we also have his spirit in us, his breath that brings us to another level, like in Ephesians, Paul talks about being seated with him in heavenly places. So we do have to look at this material body and world from a heavenly perspective in order to make sense of it. So with that said, I am going to share with you my screen. Okay. And there you go. So Charlie and I were talking about this, and she says, I think it should be healing at the well. So I just changed my drop of water that I had with sitting at the well with Messiah, changed it to this healing at the well with Messiah. Let me move this aside so I can see. Okay, so I am really narrowing this down to there. So I won't be able to see you, but Tasha will be there to help you. And I saw Charlie there too. So, so where does it all start? It all starts with our identity. So if we think about that, we're talking about our identity comes from him, because he says that we were made in his image. So the spark of life of God's power in the mother's womb is what creates that sperm and that egg come together and life can come out of that, right? So that first, it all starts in the womb with him starting life in us, right? So I just want us to go back to who he said he is, and with understanding how can we bring all our lives, the trauma of, we'll talk about this and when I mentioned that third and fourth generation, but how does it all start? So we'll just start from verse 4, where Moses cuts 2 tablets of stone like the first. So we know what happened if you read that he already had one, he went down, the golden calf, he goes back. So it says, and he rose early in the morning and went up to Mount Sinai, and as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand 2 tablets of stone. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there, and he proclaimed his name. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh passed before him and proclaimed, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, a God merciful, gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, and forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting, I highlighted that word there, or bolded, the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and to the 4th generation. So when we think about that, then we're talking about how does that happen? Okay, there. I'm trying to bring this down because it doesn't let me read. Okay, there you go. So, so let's bring in science into that scripture. Epigenetics is how the environment regulates our genetics. And when I talk about environment, or when they talk about environment, what they mean by that is that we all have genes that come down from our parents to us, and those genes, as they fold, they create protein, and we have life being formed in us. Well, it is really interesting, as science have progressed, they've realized that they used to say that the genes were actually the ones that would do everything for us, and there's nothing you can do, it's all in your genes. Well, it's not really, because, and I have a friend that this happened actually to him, so I know of a personal example of this. But if you, let's say you're born with perfect eyesight, there's nothing wrong with your eyes, but at the moment that you are born, you're put in a closet, let's say, or like in the case of my friend, he had a lazy eye, so they put a patch on his eye, and they left the patch for too long. So too long, I mean years. So what happens is that the environment, that darkness, that eye, that healthy eye was placed on, told the brain, because the light in our environment is what turns on the genetics in our body. My body was born with good eyesight, like his, right? So then I have light, and my stimuli that comes into my eyes goes to the brain and develops those nerves that go from the optic nerve that goes from your eye to the brain, and your brain says, hi, we have two eyes. Well, that's not what happened to him, because they kept patching one eye. That eye that they patched for years never developed that optic nerve. So the brain thought he had only one eye, because he doesn't have that nerve working to that eye. Then, and I hope you are making all kinds of connections with this in your mind spiritually, because they do. Okay, so then what happens is that eye, the muscles that actually help us open our eyes, close our eyes, blink, all the things that we do are developed by the need of movement. If I need to close my eyes, I have to do that motion and open it, and the same thing, squint because I can't see, it's too bright, et cetera, et cetera. So I developed those muscles. Well, he didn't develop his because there was nothing to develop, right? The eye was closed with that patch. So there was atrophy in all those muscles, they didn't develop. And so he gets to go to the doctor. So he never had eyesight on that eye, just to summarize it. So he just walked his life thinking that, that eye just never developed. There was something wrong with the eye, et cetera. Well, what happened then, he is in his 50s and he goes to a new eye doctor. For some reason, he had something. So he goes and the doctor says, what happened to your eye? He explains to him what happened. And he says, do you mind if I look into it? I'm curious to see, what happened to your eye? And he goes, well, there is nothing there to see. I'm blind from that eye. He goes, okay, just humor me. Would that be okay? And he goes, sure. So he goes in and he does all the tests to check to see the health of the eye, not the vision. And the eye was actually healthy. He couldn't see, but his eye was actually healthy. And he finds out after 50 decades that the reason why he couldn't see is because they kept that eye closed during the first 5 years of his life. And the brain didn't know that eye was there. That nerve didn't develop, and therefore it didn't develop properly, didn't grow eyesight there. So with that said, then, that in the environment not only can physically, or let's say, we have cultures that bind the feet of the children, and, for not getting into why or what, but it stops the growth, because your feet will determine how big you're going to be. You can actually put your foot here and it would fit exactly from here to here. From your wrist to for those that can't see, are not looking at me, from the wrist to your elbow. So there is something that God already created in our genetics, but if you play with that, then you are going to get a different outcome, because our feet are as big as our body is, as tall as our feet is able to hold us. And if it's being held and not allowed to grow, then you don't grow as big, because you don't need to. You just need the height that you need for the size of your foot. So, but with that, I'm also talking about emotionally and spiritually. There is most of our functions are developed by our prefrontal cortex. That is the last part of our brain to mature. But you've heard me talk about the survival mode and the limbic and the executive brain function. And that executive brain function is developed in the prefrontal cortex. And there are, which I thought it was interesting, I didn't have time to really chase this down, but there is, with the connection with the Bible, with the Word of God, that the prefrontal cortex has 9 functions. And the first thing that came to my mind, of course, it was Galatians 5, where we have the 9. The fruit of the Spirit has 9 different characteristics. So, and this is, and we will go through, I'm just going to give a big overview, like of the bird's view today. And I want to have a lot of interaction today. And then we're going to take this one by one, and not the dysfunctions, but the how trauma develops in us, so that we can work on that. With, we can really learn from this. It's not just, okay, here you go, I'm going to give you all this information, and then you don't know what to do with it, or it makes it harder to apply it to, we're all unique. So you can apply it in all different ways, but that interaction, that is what the yeshiva was all supposed to be. And actually, that's what the university was supposed to be. It wasn't supposed to be somebody up there just spouting all this knowledge and people taking notes, and then make sure you answer exactly how the teacher asked you and present it to you, so that you can get an A, you can get 100, because that's what our systems have, and even school systems have digressed to, that it should have never been. This was supposed to be an interaction. You talk, the professor gives you the information so that you can absorb it. You need to chew it, which is meditation, right? We chew the cud. So, you think about it, well, what about this? And what about that? And that interaction, I don't know if you know how a yeshiva usually works, but you sit with someone, or you stand, really. There's little tables, like bar tables really high, and you just stand with each other, and you just debate on what you think and he thinks, and then there is a moment that you change tables, and then you go with somebody else. So you are constantly being challenged, and you're expressing. And then what happens is, my mind may go somewhere, but because somebody else asked a question that I hadn't thought of, ooh, that makes me think about something else. So then my mind starts going in a different direction. And that's how we learn. We learn in community. We were never supposed to learn on, somebody stands at the pew and just gives you all this information, and you just sit, take it, and go home and try to do the best you can with it. No, we were supposed to, that's what Midrash is, right? We're supposed to interact with that and give each other's opinion, because I can only have one side of God. Our Father is so humongous that there is no human being in the world, except, his own word, Yeshua, that was exactly like him. So we can contain all that is, all who God is. So I only get a little facet of that diamond, but all of you gets a different facet. And when we come together, it can be rich. It can really be a little bit, and we're not the whole world, of course. So that means that we only get a tiny little bit from our little community of all that he is. There's just so much more that we can't even tap to it. We don't have the technology to do that with the whole world. Not that everybody will be tuning in, but with that said, I just want to tell you in a nutshell all the things that the prefrontal cortex does. So it regulates the body. It regulates the communication with each other. It attunes to that communication. So start thinking about what trauma, if this is not working, what trauma can cause in our bodies besides, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Then it also is responsible for an emotional balance. It allows us to respond, the response flexibility, whether we're going to react or respond. It helps us with that. It provides insight. It provides empathy. It provides the modulation of fear. How do we turn fear into being yirat, reverence for God, or panic and terror of that it's a fear, that it's not God's fear, it's not yirat, it is a fear that involves punishment. That's why it says perfect love casts out fear, because fear is concerned with punishment. So the fear that like, I don't want to be in causing any trouble. I don't want my mom, my dad to get angry at me, my teacher to, flunk me because he doesn't like me. That kind of fear is the one that is concerned with punishment. It's a very earthly, it's a very fleshy type of fear. God's fear is the reverence for who he is, for knowing that he is God and we are not. And he deserves the awe and admiration of someone that is way above all of us, right? Okay, so intuition, it's also provided by our prefrontal cortex, and morality. So when you think about all those things, and I think about morality, comes to my mind immediately. The ninth character of the fruit of the spirit is what? Self-control. And that is something that we see very seldom out there, and morality goes right with it. So that says a lot. But going back to this, if we are raised in nurturing environment, the negative expressions that come down from generation to generation up to the third and fourth generation are turned off, because it's kind of like, let's say alcohol is visiting my door and is knocking at the door, and I'm not interested, so I don't open the door. So it's visiting, it wants to come in to visit me, but I have no desire to open the door for it. Well, that was not the case with my older sister. My dad was what they call a dry alcoholic, because he was a functional alcoholic. He could live a life with no problem and work and all that, but he had to have alcohol every day. He had so many heart problems that the doctor said, okay, I'm going to allow you to have one whiskey with your lunch and one whiskey with your dinner, but that's it. And he got to a point where he was okay with that. He controlled himself long enough to be okay with that. But if he didn't have it, he had to have it. So when you are to that point, then you're really an alcoholic, whether you are, drinking a whole bottle and becoming erratic and, having all kinds of side effects from it, you still are. So what happened? Unfortunately, that was not the case in my family. My sister did open that door, and that was something that dragged her down for most of her life. And so one of the things that I want you to learn from this today, and has been, I'm sorry, I'm gonna get emotional, because I've seen so much pain brought by our judgmental and our blame, shame, accusative society, that good people, not just good people, God's children, have been treated very, very poorly. And by most of us, when Abba has placed them in a place of learning to overcome, teaching us to overcome, and teaching us empathy and all those things that our prefrontal cortex should be working on, right? Should be providing for us. And we have become just someone that sees the actions of people and judge them and shuts them off, and never gives them what they were looking in the first place, what got them to where the place they are. And it was because they were lacking that. So with that said, and I'll go a little bit more, explain that a little bit more, but I just want to say that now because I don't blame my daddy for what he did, and I don't blame my sister for what she did. Those were places that they were in, and depending on how you, the environment that it's around you, you have a good doctor that could have helped that lazy eye, or you had a bad doctor that covered that eye and caused him blindness, you know? So that environment, it does a lot. That's the epigenetics of it. Epi means above the genetics. So it's not just your genes, but the environment in which your genes develop. Like you can get cells from like they call mother cells, and you can put them in bone and they become bone cells. You can put them in a heart and becomes heart cells, and you can put them in a muscle and it becomes muscle cells. You know, well, a heart is a muscle, but cardio muscle or any other type of muscle. So yes, that gene in that cell says this is what I'm going to be, but depending on the environment that that cell is placed, then you have the expression. Then the genetics, the protein that genes are producing, that DNA folds in certain way to adapt to the environment that it's in. So this whole thing is about identity, right? Who we are in him, and how do we create that safe place for our children, our loved ones to grow in and be all that they could be, and not restrict them and be Egypt to them, where they become slaves to whoever we says they need to be. I'll get to that on the next slide. But here's a study that you can see. This university study was done with 155 genes of teenagers, and they showed that 120 of those genes were affected by the mother's stress level during pregnancy in the first few years of the life of those babies. And then 30 of those genes, which really surprised me, were actually affected by the father's stress in the preschool years of those babies. So the baby is not only perceiving the stress of the mom, but it's also perceiving the stress of the father. Now, the stress of the mom, it is like right there in your face, because the baby's receiving the blood from the mom, right? So if her levels, cortisol levels are really high because she's really stressed, then that baby's going to feel it right in the baby's body through the circulatory system that it's feeding, right? That placenta through the umbilical cord is feeding that baby those high levels of cortisol. And those high levels of cortisol will create problems with the receptors. We all have circuits that have receptors, and that those receptors need certain chemicals. I won't get into technical details, but they need some chemicals in order to function properly. So if they doesn't have them, because are not being provided from the inside, from being generated by your own body, then those places are going to not develop properly. But they're there. Therefore, they will look for whatever it's needed then outside, since the inside is not providing it. And then you have those also, let's say that it is, supposed to be this little, and, the flow of whatever chemical is giving it just that little bit, or, this area of adaptation, right? Is the receptor. But what happens if I just flood that thing? I'm sorry. If I flood that thing with lots of levels of cortisol, more than what it needs, and I just make from that little tube into a big tube or into a larger space. So then what happens is you're not functioning properly, and you are requiring then more of that, not the normal level, but above that level, because that's what your body got used to it when those circuitries were being formed in you. So the 30 that comes from the father's stress are less because that is something that the baby probably, you know, one of the first things that the baby develops, one of the is hearing, which makes me think of Shema, right? So the baby hears the father's voice, hears probably fights between father and mother. He hears a lot of things. So there is a side of that that also affects the baby. But as we can see in those studies, and like everything, I start from the beginning saying that we're all unique, right? So this is our 155 genes of a certain teenagers from a certain place. I don't know all the background. I don't have all the information on that study, but it would all depend of where they were, were they actually children from. I'm assuming that they had both father and mother for them to be able to differentiate between the mother's stress and the dad's stress. So we know that much, but we don't know any more than that, right? So, but that stress, whatever that level of stress on the baby, did not create the same effects than the moms, because they didn't see the effect until the preschool years, when they saw the effects of the baby's stress in the first few years, that meaning before preschool. So all this to say that it is important for us to create that place of safety for our children so that they can develop, if it is a nurturing environment, not an environment that is full of activities. Oh yeah, my kids are all in 3 languages and they're learning 2 instruments and they do 3 sports, you know, and we just take them from one place to another and the kid is totally stressed out. And we think, oh, no, that's good. Those are the years that we can stretch them because they're so flexible. And well, yes and no. If that stress is too, because we're all unique, remember that, stressful on the kid, it may be fine for another sibling, but one of them may not. And then they will start, that's where the whole thing starts crumbling, because then they compare to, I know, well, it's the same father, the same mother, the same house. How come so-and-so is this and so-and-so is that? And you know, that creates another set of problems. But going back to this, I've been listening to this Dr. Gabor Mate, and when he's a general practitioner, but he realized that he had to do something about his addiction. And in his 50s, he just starts trying to find answers to overcome his own addiction. And as he does that, he starts discovering all kinds of things. And he is really good. Like Dr. Daniel Amen is training me a lot in all the science and a lot of the holistic side of it, like, you know, your sleep and your exercise and supplements and all the different things that we need to function properly, which is awesome. Dr. Mate, because of his own addiction, he had to learn into more of what happens to people. Where does that pain come from? What does that traumatic experience, you know, really, why did he, first of all, how did he become addictive to classical music of all things? You know, he wasn't like addicted to alcohol or drugs or any type of pornography or anything like that. He was addicted to classical music. And he's like, okay, you know, I like classical music. So he spends, but when you're spending, like he says, $8,000 in classical music, you're like, whoa, that's a little bit too much, right? And we know of all kinds of addictions people may have on vehicles. They may have it on guns, or they may have it on different things. But he goes back to, he's a Jew being born in the time of war, you know, the Second World War in Budapest. And his mom is pregnant with him. No, he's already been born. He's he was a few months old when all this started. And the mom is calling the doctor and saying, I do not understand. My baby just cries and cries and cries. You need to see him. And the doctor says to her, I'm so sorry to tell you, but all my Jewish babies are crying. It's not just your son. And that is because of the stress all those mothers were under, and fathers and family, and we all know all that happened. So he wasn't really, his trauma wasn't that he didn't have family that loved him or cared for him. They were there, they care very much for him, but the stress level was so strong, and there was no time. They're in war. There's no time to nurture and have time and have eye to eye and play with the baby and stimulate, give it all the stimulus for all this, the sensory that development that he needs, and the motor development. No, he's probably just being carried from one place to another and running from one place to it was hard. So what happens is he eventually comes to the States. I think he came first here, or he lived most of his life in Canada, in Vancouver. But when he starts studying all this, he literally stops his general practice and goes into the homeless, and he wants to see what causes all these addictions, and what causes their homelessness, their mental health to decline, and all this. So as he's learning all that, because of his own problem, he's learning a lot of empathy, and that's where his forte is. It's on trauma and empathetic and sympathetic understanding and receiving the weaknesses that some of us have when we become addictive to different things. So, like I said, we all have one, and I want to give you the one, and I wrote there in the second part, is that our birth, for some people, pregnancies was wonderful. The kid had a mother that was just calm, loved, collected. She did everything she needed to in order for her pregnancy. She had no issues at home. The father didn't either. So everything developed normally. The pregnancy was just great. But comes our first trauma. And when I said, or in the case of somebody that has a bad pregnancy, it would be their second trauma. But that trauma is universal. We all had it. We all have to come out of Egypt through that constrict arrow between those two walls of water, right? And then we come out into a place that is bright, and that it's cold, and that there is all kinds of noises and other voices, not the voice of the mother and the father that the baby was so accustomed to hear. But we hear all this, and that is one thing that it's coming back, especially with midwifery, bringing back the whole notion that the first thing that baby needs is your chest, is your skin, is to feel safe, because all of a sudden he's been thrust into a world, into an environment that he doesn't know. He doesn't know what's going around, happening around him, and that is creating pain, cold. The body starts trying to adjust the temperature, and all kinds of things are happening. He's breathing for the first time. All these things are new, right? So but when you put the baby back in the chest of the mother and can hear the heartbeat that was so comforting to him for 9 months, feels the skin of the mom, feels the warmth of her embrace, then the baby starts developing those neurotransmitters that will, that endorphin that is going to go into those receptors in the brain circuits, so that the baby can start developing healthy. Well, when they take the baby out and wash them, first of all, just taking all the protective factors that God has put for the baby They're not supposed to be washed and stripped out like that when you're first born and all this. We won't get into all that, but most of the time the baby's put in a different room, depending on where, how your hospital deals with that. If some are allowed you to have the baby with you, but they're separated from you. So all of a sudden, that is our first attachment and separation anxiety for a baby, is that, and that's one of the reasons that they're bound like that with the blanket, because the baby is not used to being in an open environment. They're used to being holed in, right? So when we have that situation, depending of the nurturing of the parents, then we will see all kinds of things develop. Another thing that we hear a lot is, oh, don't pick up that baby. It's, you're just going to spoil the baby. And the baby doesn't know. The baby's only way of telling you that something is wrong is by crying. Now take that to an adult, because it's not just a baby. Most of us, the only way we know if at any moment we're triggered, at any moment, like I just did, I was just triggered by my emotions. And what did I do? I cried. We would cry because that's the first instinct that God gives us to ask for help or to express ourselves, is crying. And so when that baby's crying, it's telling you something, and you are ignoring him because, oh, he already ate, I already changed his diaper, I don't do, he can cry, he will be fine, he can fall asleep crying. My goodness, I've heard that, I've said it, and it breaks my heart, because all that baby is feeling is, I'm not loved. I am not, if the baby, if this is a second trauma, not the first, because it was a very painful pregnancy, at that moment that you're not picking that baby up, all you're saying is, you're not worth anything. You are the one who made me go through all the pain and whatever I felt. The baby thinks it's all his fault. Mommy's angry at me. And they don't know, like that mom, it's concerned about the war. That baby doesn't know about genocide. He doesn't know anything about war. He doesn't know anything about any of that. All he knows is, my mom is really stressed and it must be my fault. We automatically think it's our fault. So if anything can be learned from this, the first thing is always, and I'm telling you, I wrote this down because it's something I want to tell my kids. My anger, my stress, my shortcomings were completely my own struggles with my own trauma from my childhood of unresolved issues, and had absolutely nothing to do with you. You didn't cause them. Even if I said, you're driving me crazy, I can't take it anymore, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing that? Etc., etc. Whatever came out of your mouth that made that child think it was his fault or her fault, it wasn't. It was that parents or ours issues with our unresolved issues. And that is where I would like to go into how that trauma develops. So we have trauma, right? That is created when we experience a painful situation and we are alone. So that's why isolation is the worst thing we can do. Timeout is the worst thing we can do for a child, because we are reinforcing, yep, you need to be away because there's something wrong with you. They are not thinking at that point, the fear is so strong that go over there and think about it. That's the last thing a child is able to do, because fear is so strong. It's like, what is going to happen? I need my mom and my daddy to grow. I need my mom and my daddy to live. So if they separate me from them, then I'm going to die. So there is not a place to think at all. So, so we develop a process to deal with that, right? And I can detach myself, I can dissociate, or I can emotionally shut down. There's many things that we're going to talk more about that in other calls that are going to be ways for me to survive, because otherwise I can't cope with the pain. But if that pain, if I have somebody, that's why community is so important, because if I have somebody that can walk alongside with me and acknowledge and validate my pain, then I'm able then to say, okay, Blaine says you did this to yourself for your bad choices. Therefore, you deserve, what's coming to you. And when actually whatever I did was a self-protective mechanism in order to survive. And depending on what the situation, yes, it could be a really bad self-defense mechanism, but sometimes it's not as bad, like workaholics, right? Oh, she works so hard. Oh, he works so hard. So that's actually applauded and rewarded. But it is still an addiction if I'm using that to make me feel better, to calm that pain inside of me, feel that gap that it's in my heart, right? So we have to, nothing wrong with working hard. I think working hard is important. The word says, he who doesn't work does not eat. So we're supposed to work, right? But our Father has given us ways to deal with our situations so that eventually when we are stronger, when we are capable to dealing with those things, then we can overcome them. But in the meantime, it helps us to survive. But responsibility is what we really need to work on. And it is realizing that what happened, like I said to my dad or my sister, or me, I've been a workaholic most of my life, is that there is no blame in that. There was a reason that had to happen, but that doesn't mean that is who I am. And I can overcome that, because if it's all about identity, is dad's identity in me, not my environment identity. So we do validate, we do acknowledge, because like it says there, painful experiences produces a wound that causes pain when it's touched, if it's still fresh. But we have people that will be, reacting like from something that happened way back. And you're like, goodness gracious, that happened to you when you were 5 years old. Well, that wound is still fresh a lot of the time, because remember, without being, when trauma occurs and there is a lack of producing the neurotransmitters that helps us regulate, all that prefrontal cortex is not working, then, well, and it doesn't really work in the first years of life anyhow. You are the prefrontal cortex of your child, and you weren't working, so obviously it didn't work for the child. Then all those things that I mentioned that had to be regulated are not being regulated. So the child has a hard time regulating the body. We see all the sicknesses that come later on in life. We see problems at tuning. It's like, I'm talking to you, but you're not hearing me. You're not hearing my tone. You're not getting what I'm saying, because your insight, your empathy, your intuition, your morality, all those things didn't develop properly. So it's not like you don't want to, you just can't. Those places were not developed properly. It doesn't mean, I love Dr. Amen always says, none of that is a sentence in your life that you will never get it. We can improve all that. We can heal all those things. And that's what this is going to be. This is going to be our university. This is going to be our Musar place, which is also kind of like a yeshiva too. But it is a place that we are going to develop. The bride is making herself ready, and we're going to prepare ourselves to overcome the past and not be anxious about the future. Remember, past brings depression, present brings stress, future brings anxiety. So we need to deal with those three. And we go in and out of those at different times all our lives. So we just need to, and some people do more on one and less on another, but we all go through all those three. So that is part of dealing with this. Now, what happens if it did heal and it created scar tissue and you're numb there? How many people have had problems in the past, traumas in the past, and right now doesn't face, certain things don't face them because they're numb there. So, some can be overreactive and some can just be numb, feel nothing. Both need to be, we can get rid of scar tissue. So both can be worked on. And I think, okay, so here I'm going to end with this. So when we enrolled in this yeshiva or university, from the moment of conception, everything that we go through is part of our curriculum. Alan Moratis says that. I was so glad when I read it, that in his book. I'm like, in Musar, he's one of the Musar teachers, and I'm like, oh, I've always thought this, and I'm so glad that somebody else affirmed and validated what I felt, that it's, all of us, when we graduate and we're learning all this, so we're all in practice. We are ministers of reconciliation. That is one area that we hear very little about. And it is what he calls us. We are all ambassadors and ministers of reconciliation. So what does that mean? Well, we learn from understanding that we all have faced trauma, and depending on how that birth eventually developed in any of us, it was better or worse for others. It's still the same trauma, and then that caused other traumas to develop by wrong choices and things like that. There were defense mechanisms, there were self-protective modes that our Father gave us. So there is no blame. We can't be blaming each other. We can't be blaming our parents. They had their own curriculum. We all have our curriculum. So what are we going to do with it? We're going to learn, and we're going to learn techniques to heal. There are plenty. They are being actually developed since the past 50 years. You just check it out, and you'll find all kinds of modalities out there to, well, I said the last 50 years for the Western world. There is a lot of modalities that have been used long before then in the Eastern side of the world. But we're going to learn those things, and we're going to learn to see what fits. I may not be able to fight with Saul's armor, right? Just like David couldn't when he confronted Goliath. So we are all going to test and see which one works for me, and we're going to go with that. It's not a cookie cutter type of training, because we're all different, and we all need different things. We all hear differently from different people. So it's okay. The important things is that we're going to learn how to cope with trauma, understand what is disassociation, and how we tune out things. Because, people say, oh, I'm just, what is the word? Selective. I just have selective hearing. Well, you're tuning out something. It's really what it is. But emotional shutdown, we all do that. We all do at different times, just emotionally down. And how I want you to understand how physically all those things actually are, so that we don't blame each other, or we don't look down at each other when I was able to get over that. I was able to do this. I was next month, gave birth, and the next week I'm doing this, that, and the other. Well, good for you. That doesn't mean that everybody is the same, but we tend to do that and judge each other and size each other up, or ourselves against each other, or feel like I'm nobody, but so-and-so is so big. So you've heard me talk about this. I've said it many times, because it is unfortunately a way that we deal with those are self mechanisms. We're going to talk about depersonalization on some of them, how we displace things and become something else so that we can survive. And a lot of those things are actually good. They actually look good. they are socially acceptable, and but they're still not us. So the whole thing is, if the bride is getting herself ready and it has to be more of him and less of me, that means that there is an identity way down in the bottom of each one of us that is his image in us. And all this epigenetics that we've all accumulated according to the family, the culture, and the place we are all have been born has to be dealt with. And he's going to help us with that. The Bible is full of amazing ways to show us how it's possible. Yes, we can be overcomers. Yes, we are overcomers. If you and I are here seeing each other right now, we have overcome however many years you've lived. You know, I can look back and say, yeah, I survived 61 years and getting ready for the next. So is every single one of you. So with that said, I'm going to stop this sharing and open it up for, oh goodness, there's 30 things in the chat. I don't know that I can read them all, but go for it. And I will, you know, if you want to ask it in case I don't get to it, it might have been just in between you guys, and that's perfectly fine too. Any questions? The rib cage is one area. One area of what? Yeah, see, it's going to be hard to physical and spiritual. We need to keep the core attached until it stops pushing. Yep, the vernix. Yep. Okay. Well, ladies, this is your chance to ask questions.
I want to ask a question, but I don't want to do it during the recording. I think we
Oh,
just
yes. I actually thank you, because I was just going to do that. Hold on one second.